Darkness does not always fall with the setting of the sun. Sometimes it takes the shape of a family, the Ravencrofts, a name once spoken with reverence, until it soured into a curse. Their story is not folklore. It is not a Gothic novel. It is history fragmented, buried, and almost forgotten. Almost beneath the facade of wealth, piety, and respectability, the Ravencrofts concealed something far darker. They were landowners, churchgoers, and pillars of their community. But behind closed doors, their inheritance was not gold or property, it was obsession. An obsession with unlocking the mysteries of the human soul, with bending suffering into a tool, with sacrificing flesh in pursuit of what they called understanding. It was Elder Ezra Ravencroft who gave this obsession its most terrifying form. A preacher to some, a prophet to others, he wielded scripture with a charisma that blurred faith into fanaticism. He spoke of purification through pain, of vessels broken so the spirit might be revealed, and people followed him willingly. To the outside world, the family were benefactors and believers, but to those who saw the truth, they were something else entirely, orchestrators of ritual. Dealers in death, manipulators who cloaked cruelty in holy words. The evidence is scattered, but chilling. Old letters warning neighbors not to walk near the Ravencroft church at night. Physicians' diaries quietly noting bodies with surgical precision cuts. Investigator Blackwood's reports describing hidden chambers beneath sanctuaries and fires. Set to erase evidence before the law could arrive, and perhaps most haunting of all, a journal, written in Elder Ezra's own hand, recovered decades later. Its final entry read, "The work continues as it must." Each vessel contributes to understanding. Each elevation brings the revelation closer. 100 years from now, all will recognize our sacrifice as the foundation of a new age. The Spirit is patient. So too must be its servants. Did Elder Ezra perish in the flames that consumed his church, or did he vanish slipping into the shadows with his disciples? Did the bloodline end, or do descendants still carry his legacy? No one can say for certain. But what is certain is this: the Ravencrofts were real, their crimes were real, and their shadow lingers in unsolved disappearances, in forgotten ruins, in the unsettling truth that human ambition can be far more monstrous than any ghost story. Tonight, we open the door they left behind. We descend into their darkness, and we unravel the macabre history of the Ravencroft family, a sinister tale not of legend, but of humanity at its most corrupted. Every story has roots, and the Ravencroft family story is buried deep entwined with the soil of early America, where faith, superstition, and ambition often collided in unsettling ways. To understand the horrors that would eventually unfold, we must first step back to the late 18th century, when the Ravencrofts first established themselves in the Hudson Valley. They were not nobility, but they carried themselves as if chosen wealthy landowners, importing books, instruments, and ideas from Europe. Their estate, Ravenwood, quickly became known as a gathering place for intellectuals, clergymen, and physicians. Outwardly, the family projected refinement and piety. Their patriarch, Jonathan Ravencroft, funded churches and charitable works. Their matriarch, Margaret, was known for her interest in philosophy and the natural sciences. Neighbors called them enlightened, progressive, even visionary. But whispers circulated too. Strange lights flickering in the windows long after midnight. Deliveries of surgical equipment to the estate despite no one being trained as a physician. And most unsettling servants who entered the household often seemed to leave abruptly, or not at all. At the time, such rumors were easy to dismiss as envy toward a prosperous family. But in hindsight, they reveal something else: the careful beginnings of an obsession. The Ravencrofts were not simply wealthy or educated. They were seekers of knowledge that others feared to touch, knowledge of the body, the spirit, and the boundary between life and death itself. By the early 19th century, this obsession had found its most fervent voice in Jonathan's grandson, Ezra Ravencroft. He trained not as a doctor or minister, but as something in between: a preacher who spoke in the cadence of Scripture but dwelled on themes of sacrifice, purification, and transcendence. His sermons carried a hypnotic quality, weaving biblical verses with his own reinterpretations, To his congregation he was magnetic, to outsiders unsettling. Ezra insisted that true salvation required not only prayer, but transformation pain, trial, and elevation. And the family, long accustomed to secrecy, enabled him. Their resources funded his gatherings. Their land became his sanctuary, and their reputation shielded him from suspicion. This was the turning point. What began as quiet intellectual curiosity now hardened into ritual. The Ravencrofts were no longer merely eccentric benefactors, they were becoming something darker. Something organized. When disappearances began to ripple through nearby towns in the 1830s, few dared to point fingers. Who would accuse such a respected family? Who would believe, in a young nation priding itself on progress, that rituals of blood and spirit could lurk beneath the pews of a church? Yet beneath that veneer of civility, the groundwork for horror had already been laid, the stage was set, and in the years that followed, the Ravencroft's name would become synonymous not with enlightenment, but with a macabre legacy of manipulation, cruelty, and belief twisted beyond recognition. Every family carries secrets, but for the Ravencrofts, secrecy wasn't a burden, it was tradition. Their darkness didn't emerge suddenly. It grew, like ivy creeping up stone, hidden in plain sight until the entire foundation was consumed. The earliest trace of that darkness can be found in Jonathan, Ravencroft himself. While the world remembered him as a wealthy landowner and patron of the church, his private journals told a different story, one of obsession. Pages filled with anatomical sketches, notes on alchemy, and long passages copied from forbidden European texts. He wrote of the soul as something that could be measured, extracted, even transferred. He believed death was not an end, but a puzzle waiting to be solved. To his peers, he was simply a man of learning. But those who worked within the estate whispered of strange experiments in the cellar, farm animals dissected under candlelight, bones boiled clean and catalogued, and always the patriarch watching with unblinking fascination, recording every detail as though mapping the road to eternity. It was Margaret, his wife, who nurtured this pursuit. She was no passive partner, but an active conspirator. A woman with a sharp intellect and a colder heart, she guided Jonathan's studies toward ritual, binding science with mysticism. Neighbors who visited the Ravenwood estate spoke of her unnerving presence, her pale figure drifting through candlelit halls, her voice calm, deliberate, almost hypnotic. Where Jonathan provided the hunger, Margaret gave it structure. Together, they instilled in their children the belief that the family was chosen guardians of a truth too terrible for the world to see. This conviction became a creed, passed down, like an heirloom, and with each generation the doctrine grew bolder. By the time Ezra Ravencroft was born, the family no longer whispered its secrets, they preached them. Ezra inherited Jonathan's fascination with the body, Margaret's obsession with ritual, and added something neither of them possessed: charisma. He could turn fear into faith, doubt into devotion. Where his grandfather had hidden in cellars, Ezra stepped boldly into the pulpit. His voice carried not just conviction but command, and soon others began to follow. What had begun as a private fixation had now transformed into a movement and ideology. The Ravencrofts no longer sought merely to understand the line between life and death. They sought to cross it, manipulate it, and ultimately control it. And that is where the darkness took root, not in madness, not in poverty, not in desperation, but in ambition, in the unshakable belief that they were destined to uncover truths denied to ordinary mortals, that their family alone could step beyond the veil and return with revelations. This was the seed from which their legacy of horror would bloom. And once planted, there would be no stopping what grew from it. They called themselves the Church of the Pure Spirit. To outsiders, it was a name that suggested virtue, sanctity, and a kind of divine clarity. But step closer pull. Back the veil, and the reality was nothing short of a nightmare disguised as faith. Founded in the quiet corners of New England during the 1830s, the church was not born of light, but of shadow. At its center stood two men, Elder Ezra and Deacon Silas Ravencroft brothers, bound not only by blood but by obsession, they claimed. Their church was a path to transcendence, a bridge between flesh and spirit. Yet in truth, it was a theater of manipulation, cruelty, and ritualized death. The Ravencrofts did not preach salvation in the traditional sense. They spoke of elevation. Not merely a spiritual awakening, but a literal transformation, an ascension of the soul, freed from the imperfections of the human body. Their followers were told that through sacrifice and ritual, they could be made into vessels of eternal knowledge. But as investigators would later discover, those vessels were not metaphorical. They were human beings stripped, arranged, and drained in ways too grotesque for words. Inside the dimly lit chapel, Elder Ezra's sermons held his audience spellbound. His voice, calm yet commanding, carried promises of enlightenment. He wove scripture with pseudoscience, ancient mysticism with modern obsession. To the untrained ear, it sounded profound. To those already desperate, grieving, or lost, it sounded like hope. The spirit, Ezra declared, is shackled by weak flesh, but we will free it. Each vessel, each elevation brings us closer to revelation. You will not do will transform this rhetoric worked like poison disguised as wine. Men and women flocked to him, convinced they had found a path few others dared to tread. Once inside the church, however, leaving was nearly impossible. At the heart of the church's practices were the infamous rituals referred to only as elevations. The followers were told these ceremonies were holy, that through them the chosen vessel would become something greater, transcending the frailties of life. The reality was far darker. Conducted in underground chambers beneath the chapel, the rituals were carefully orchestrated acts of mutilation and death. Witnesses who later escaped described candlelit rooms thick with incense, hymns distorted into chants, and victims placed on wooden platforms. They were dressed in white linen, their arms stretched out, bodies positioned in a manner eerily reminiscent of crucifixion, but instead of divine ascension, there was only silence and blood. Some of the chosen went willingly, entranced by Ezra's promises. Others, as later letters revealed, were tricked or abducted immigrants, drifters, men and women with no families to miss them. To the Ravencrofts, these outsiders were perfect offerings, expendable lives to feed their grotesque pursuit of knowledge. For ordinary members, daily life was a careful mix of devotion and control. The Ravencrofts structured every waking moment. Followers worked on church grounds, lived in cramped quarters, and attended sermons multiple times a day. Letters were monitored, movement restricted, questions silenced. Those who wavered in their faith were publicly humiliated. Some were forced to stand in silence for hours in the cold, others beaten under the guise of purification. The goal was always the same, submission, and yet among many followers, there was a strange, unsettling sense of pride. Survivors described how believers competed to be seen as most loyal, hoping they might one day be chosen for elevation. Few understood what that actually meant until it was far too late. What made the Church of the Pure Spirit especially chilling was its deliberate merging of religion and science. Elder Ezra often spoke not only of scripture, but of anatomy, chemistry, and natural philosophy. He presented the Church's work as a kind of divine experiment bridging spiritual salvation with physical study. To this end, the Ravencrofts allegedly collaborated with physicians and scholars willing to look the other way. Specimens, blood, organs, bones were quietly exchanged. Investigators later uncovered records linking the Church to medical professionals in Boston, Philadelphia, even as far as Baltimore. Some accepted the materials for study, others profited in silence. In this way, the Church was not an isolated cult, but part of a larger, unsettling network where science's hunger for knowledge collided with religious fanaticism. By the late 1840s, the Church had grown beyond a small congregation. Satellite groups appeared in neighboring towns, fragments of the same twisted ideology, taking root under different names. Each small community was tethered back to Ravenwood, where Ezra and Silas maintained their grip. Recruitment was subtle. Travelers promised work, immigrants offered shelter, the lonely told they had finally found family, and always the promise of something greater, freedom from pain, enlightenment beyond human understanding. For the desperate, It was irresistible. Perhaps the most infamous discovery during the eventual investigation was what lay beneath: the church itself. Hidden doors led to tunnels, which led to chambers carved out of the earth. Here, victims were elevated. Here, experiments blurred the line between ritual and research. Investigators uncovered wooden platforms stained dark with years of use, surgical tools resting beside cruciform frames, and shelves lined with jars remnants of failed experiments. It was not only a church. It was a laboratory of death. The church's downfall began, as it so often does, with cracks from within. Survivors later spoke of whispers, doubts, and the slow realization that elevation did not mean ascension, but annihilation. Some fled, others secretly reached out to authorities. By 1851, the whispers had become a roar. The investigation that followed would unearth horrors that stunned even hardened officers. At least 276 confirmed victims. Letters revealing systematic abduction. Physicians implicated. Wealthy patrons exposed, but even as the church collapsed, Elder Ezra slipped away, vanishing like a shadow into the night. Though its physical walls were torn down, the ideology of the church never truly died. In the years that followed, scattered, groups appeared under different names, bearing the same marks: secret rituals, missing persons, journals that echoed Ezra's words. Whether he lived to see these offshoots, or whether they were the work of devoted followers carrying on his vision, remains unclear. But the fear endured, because at its heart, the Church of the Pure Spirit was never about salvation. It was about control, about obsession, and about the darkness that emerges when human life is treated as nothing more than a vessel for someone else's ambition. The Church of the Pure Spirit stands as one of history's most chilling reminders of what happens when faith is twisted into fanaticism, when leaders use belief as a weapon, and when science, stripped of morality, becomes a tool of horror. But as we'll see, this was not the end of the Ravencroft story. It was only the beginning. They believed the truth had been hidden, that the world was a prison of illusions, and that only through fire, through destruction, could purity be restored. This was the doctrine of the final chapter of the Church of the Pure Spirit. It was not simply a belief system anymore. It had become a weapon. By the early 1850s, whispers of doubt and betrayal had begun to spread through the congregation. Some followers were shaken by the disappearances. Others were haunted by visions that Elder Ezra himself encouraged, insisting these dreams were not nightmares, but divine messages. It was during one such sermon that Ezra unveiled what he called the revelations. He spoke not of heaven or salvation, but of purification through fire. He declared that the earth was infested with corruption, that the soul was suffocating under layers of sin, and that the only way forward was to burn away the falsehoods of the world. The flesh is weak, the spirit is eternal, but the world is a rotting husk. We are the fire. We are the hand of the pure spirit. And through flame, truth will rise. The congregation erupted not in fear, but in rapture. To them, this was liberation. To burn was not to destroy. To burn was to cleanse. Shortly after the revelations, a new ceremony emerged, the cleansing flame. Unlike the secretive rituals of elevation, this was public. Every member was called to witness. In the center of the chapel stood a great iron brazier, its flames fed with oils, herbs, and, according to later reports, blood. Members were instructed to cast their possessions into the fire: letters from families, clothing from their past lives, heirlooms that tied them to the outside world. One survivor would later recall, "It was as though we were burning ourselves, piece by piece. And the more we burned, the less we belonged to the world outside. We were no longer who we had been. We were only the church." But the ritual did not stop there. In time, the brazier became a pyre. Animals were offered. Then people. The first human sacrifice under the cleansing flame was framed as voluntary. A woman named Miriam, who had lost her family to sickness and claimed she wished to ascend. Before the congregation, Ezra laid his hand on her head and declared, "The fire will free her spirit. The ash will bear witness." She was lowered into the flames, her screams swallowed by hymns. By morning there was nothing left but ash. And for The Ravencrofts. Nothing more convincing than the obedience of those who watched and did not turn away. As months passed, the doctrine of flame grew. Entire gatherings ended with bonfires, where members danced in circles, chanting songs of purification. Some claimed to see visions in the fire faces of the departed. Shapes of angels, messages etched in smoke. Others claimed the fire spoke directly to them. Deacon Silas, quieter than his brother, but no less devoted, began insisting that the flames revealed secrets. He told followers where hidden sins lay, who harbored doubts, who needed purification. Accusations followed. The guilty or those declared guilty were cast into the flames. It was no longer ritual. It was execution disguised as faith, but the church's hunger did not stop at its own members. By the mid-1850s, fires began to appear outside the church walls, a barn in one town, a home in another. Then, entire neighborhoods reduced to ash. The Church of the Pure Spirit did not claim these acts publicly, but within their sermons, Ezra spoke of the cleansing of the unworthy. His words dripped with implication. Local authorities suspected arson but could not prove it. Survivors who had escaped the congregation, however, described a different story. Groups of followers, robed in white, moving by night, carrying torches and oil. Each fire was not random, it was ritual. A secret sermon carried out in smoke and flame, and soon the surrounding towns began to fear not only the Ravencrofts, but the fire itself. It was this spreading terror that finally drew the attention of state authorities. Rumors of mass burnings, missing persons, and whispered sacrifices reached the ears of Boston officials. An investigation was launched, but by the time they arrived, the Ravencrofts had already prepared for their final act. Inside the chapel, Elder Ezra proclaimed a new vision. The pure spirit has spoken. The world will resist, but fire will prevail. If they seek to destroy us, we shall become the flame itself. We will not be taken, we will be eternal. What followed was perhaps the most horrific chapter of all. When authorities closed in on the church in the winter of 1857, they expected resistance. What they found instead was a nightmare. The chapel was locked from within. Through the windows, investigators saw the glow of fire. Members, dressed in white robes, stood in unison, singing hymns as the flames spread. Oil had been poured across the floorboards. Torches were lit. In what can only be described as a mass immolation, dozens of followers willingly walked into the flames, chanting even as the smoke choked the air. The time the doors were broken down, the church was an inferno. Bodies lay charred, twisted, fused together in grotesque shapes. Survivors were few. Among them were children pulled out by officers against their will, screaming to be returned to the fire. Elder Ezra's body was never found. Some claimed he perished in the flames. Others whispered he had escaped in the chaos. His prophecy unfinished. In the days that followed, the townspeople sifted through what remained. They found scorched texts, journals half burned but still legible. In them were writings that confirmed the horror, Ezra's visions, Silas's accusations. The doctrine of flame carried out with chilling precision. The journals revealed the terrifying logic behind the fire, that it was not death, but transformation, that the ash carried the essence of the Spirit, scattering it into the world like seed. One passage read, "In the ash we are free, in the flame we are reborn. The world will know us not by flesh, but by smoke." Even in ruin, the Church of the Pure Spirit did not vanish entirely. In the years that followed, scattered fires were reported, strange blazes in abandoned barns, isolated cabins, even graveyards, always accompanied by whispers of chanting. Always unexplained, some believed surviving members carried the doctrine into secret. Others claimed imitators, inspired by the legend, had taken up the fire themselves, but the most disturbing accounts came from those who swore the fire itself carried a presence, that when the wind shifted and the flames crackled, they could hear voices singing, pleading, proclaiming the cleansing flame. It seemed had not been extinguished. The story of the revelations and the cleansing flame is not simply one of madness. It is a portrait of how faith, when twisted into fanaticism, can justify the unthinkable. It shows us how ordinary men and women desperate for meaning, can be led not just into obedience, but into fire. It reminds us of the most chilling truth of all. Sometimes, destruction is not seen as an end, but as salvation. When the flames of the Church of the Pure Spirit died, one might think the story ended there. That with the ashes of their chapel, their voices too were silenced. But horror does not vanish so easily. It lingers, it seeps, it stains. What was left behind was not just a smoldering ruin, but a legacy, a shadow that crept into the lives of those who had seen the fire, and even into the lives of those who had not. For generations, the Church of the Pure Spirit would be remembered not in sermons, not in scripture, but in whispered warnings, in nightmares passed from parent to child, and in the quiet fear that sometimes the fire still burned. This is their legacy of horror. Out of the inferno that consumed the church in 1857, only a handful survived. They were not celebrated. They were not pitied. They were haunted. Authorities tried to debrief them, but what they heard unsettled even the most hardened men. Children cried not for their lost parents, but for the fire itself, screaming to be returned to the flames. One boy, no older than 9, scratched at the skin of his arms until he bled, begging for the ash to free him. Adults fared no better. Survivors described visions, voices, dreams of fire that would not let them rest. In letters preserved by investigators, one woman wrote, "When I close my eyes, I see them in the flames. They do not burn. They reach for me, calling my name. The fire will not let me go." Many of these survivors disappeared in the years that followed. Some were institutionalized, others simply vanished last seen wandering into the forests, or in several cases near the ruins of the old church itself. The legacy began here, not with death, but with the torment of the living, the towns near. The Ravencrofts' chapel did not escape unscathed. In fact, they became unwilling keepers of the legend. For decades after the fire, locals avoided the ruins. Children dared one another to approach the charred remains, while adults whispered warnings. Stay away. The ground is cursed, and yet fires still broke out. Small at first, a field, a barn. But each time, rumors swirled. It's them. The pure spirit lives. Whether by accident or by hand, the townsfolk began to see flame itself as a presence. Entire families relocated, hoping to outrun the superstition. Those who remained often spoke of seeing robed figures at night, walking along the tree line, carrying torches that vanished into the darkness. The Ravencrofts were dead, but their shadow was alive. Among the most disturbing elements of this legacy were the children. Survivors raised in foster homes or institutions carried with them strange rituals, fragments of chants, drawings of fire and ash. Teachers recorded incidents of children attempting to burn their own possessions sometimes, even their own hands claiming they were offering it to the spirit. One chilling report from 1872 described a boy who set fire to a churchyard, later telling authorities, "They were in the flames. They told me I was chosen." Some historians argue that these children represented the true continuation of the Church of the Pure Spirit, not in buildings or gatherings, but in memory, in trauma, and in blood. Even now, rumors persist of families tracing their ancestry back to the congregation, families who speak of the gift of fire. As the decades wore on, the ruins of the chapel took on a life of their own. By the early 1900s, it had become a place of legend. Locals swore the ground remained scorched, that no grass would grow where the fire had once raged. Travelers claimed to hear faint singing when the wind carried across the ruins. One journalist who visited in 1908 described the scene as follows: "The stones themselves seemed blackened with something more than fire. I felt watched as though the ashes remembered. The most chilling accounts were of lights at night orange flickers in the trees, moving like processions. Farmers, hunters, and travelers alike spoke of seeing entire gatherings in the distance, vanishing when approached. It was here that the church ceased to be history and became folklore. In the early 20th century, a wave of mysterious fires swept across New England. Abandoned houses, old barns, even graveyards were set ablaze. Authorities called them arson. Locals called them something else. they pointed to. The old stories of the pure spirit to the warnings of their grandparents. Each fire seemed to renew the legend. Some claimed to find strange markings carved into the soil near the blaze's symbols resembling suns, circles, and flames, one fire. Chief in 1921 reportedly told his men, "We're not fighting a blaze. We're fighting ghosts." Of course, rational minds dismissed this as hysteria. But for those who lived near the ruins, the pattern was undeniable. The pure spirit had become less a church and more a curse. Perhaps the most terrifying discovery came years after the fire itself. While clearing debris from the ruins, investigators found several books partially burned, but still legible. They contained Ezra Ravencroft's sermons, his visions, and his revelations of the cleansing flame. These texts did not speak of salvation. They spoke of rebirth through destruction, of a world consumed so that purity could rise. More disturbing. Still, they contained instructions, rituals of fire, chants to be spoken, diagrams of symbols that matched those later found at fire sites. The texts were locked away, but fragments leaked. Scholars copied passages, journalists sensationalized them, and in the shadows, some imitated them. To this day, rumors persist of copies hidden in private collections of sects who still follow the Ravencroft's path. And wherever the texts appear, fires are never far behind. What makes the legacy of the pure spirit so chilling is not just what they did, but how they endure. Unlike many cults, they left behind no monuments, no official history, no proud descendants. What they left instead was fear. They became a ghost story told by firelight, a legend that crept into the cracks of memory. And in some ways, that makes them even more powerful. Because legends do not die. They grow, they shift. They survive not in stone, but in the imagination. Even now, over a century and a half later, there are those who will not speak their name. Those who insist that to say it aloud is to invite the flame, from the fires of 1857 to the scattered blazes. Of the 20th century, one question remains: was the Church of the Pure Spirit truly destroyed? Or did it scatter like ash into the wind? Survivors vanished. Children carried fragments. Texts resurfaced. Fires returned. Again and again, the pattern repeated. What began as one church in one forest became a myth that outlived its creators. A myth that transformed into something larger, darker, harder to contain. Perhaps is the most frightening truth of all. The Church of the Pure Spirit did not die. It changed. It adapted. It became eternal, not as flesh and blood, but as terror. The legacy of horror is not measured in bodies or even in ruins. It is measured in how the fear endures. For the Ravencrofts, flame was not destruction, but revelation. For their followers, death was not an ending, but a passage. And for those who survived them, the fire became a memory that would not fade. Even now, when a sudden fire breaks out in the dead of night, when the wind shifts and the smoke curls in strange shapes, when the crackle of flame sounds almost like voices, some still whisper the same words, passed down for over 150 years. The pure spirit burns in that moment you realize the church may be gone, the people may be ash, but the horror still lives when the flames devoured the church. Of the pure spirit, the world believed the nightmare had ended, the Ravencrofts were gone. Their congregation burned, scattered, silenced. The chapel reduced to little more than ash and ruin, but history has a way of lying to us, because some horrors do not die with their makers. They linger, they breathe, they wait. The fire did not consume everything. What remained was not stone, nor scripture, nor flesh. It was something more insidious, an echo, a shadow, a ghost, those who walked past the ruins after the fire swore. They felt it, a pressure in the air, a heaviness in their chest, as though unseen hands pressed against them. Birds avoided the clearing. Animals circled but would not cross. And at night villagers spoke of faint lights, like embers, drifting above the blackened soil. Some said it was the dead, refusing to be buried. Others whispered it was the pure spirit itself, but all agreed on one thing: the fire had not destroyed the church. It had only unleashed it. This is the story not of the church that burned, but of the ghosts that remained The first signs came from the survivors. The few who staggered from the inferno alive. They were not celebrated as miracles. They were pitied, avoided, feared. One boy, 9 years old, was found in the woods 2 days later. He was barefoot, his arms covered in scratches, his clothes black with soot. He told rescuers he had tried to walk back into the fire, that the flames were calling his name, that his parents were inside, not screaming in pain, but singing another. A woman in her 30s could not sleep. She wrote letters to her sister describing visions, faces flickering in the fire, their mouths moving in silent chants. She insisted the flames spoke to her in words she could not understand, but always in the voice of Ezra Ravencroft himself. Most of these survivors did not last long. Some disappeared. Others were committed to asylums, muttering about ash and purity until their final days. And yet their stories spread. Their words were repeated. The Ravencrofts were dead, but their message lived on, carried by the broken voices of those who had escaped. It was the survivors who gave birth to the first whispers of haunting, for they insisted the fire was not finished, that what had burned was only the beginning, that something remained. If you were to travel to the ruins in the decades after the fire, you would find nothing more than a clearing. Blackened stones, soil that seemed never to heal. A silence that pressed too hard on the ears, and yet visitors always reported the same things, the feeling of being watched, the faint sound of singing carried by the wind, and most disturbing of all, the sense that the fire was still there, hidden beneath the earth, waiting. Children dared one another to step onto the scorched ground. Most ran out screaming within seconds, claiming to hear whispers in the ash. A few said they saw figures, black shapes, moving along the tree line, carrying torches that vanished when approached. Travelers told of lights flickering at night. Farmers swore their crops near the ruins withered faster. Hunters avoided the area altogether, calling it cursed. But the most terrifying accounts came from those who lingered too long. In 1889, a journalist from Boston visited the ruins hoping to write a sensational piece on the cult that burned. He arrived skeptical. He left broken. In his notes, found after his suicide weeks later, he wrote, "The stones breathe. I heard them. Beneath my feet, something shifts. I saw faces in the soot. They whispered my name. The fire is not gone. It waits. It watches. It wants." He never finished his article, but his fragments fueled new rumors, that the ruins were not empty, that the ghosts of the pure spirit did not rest. The land itself had become a vessel, a shrine to what lingered. The fire took their bodies, but it did not take their children, for among the survivors of the Church of the Pure Spirit were mothers who carried unborn lives within them, infants who grew into children with hollow eyes and dreams scorched by smoke. By the 1860s, whispers spread through upstate New York. Children born to survivors of the fire were different, strange. Some spoke in their sleep, chanting words their parents swore they had never taught them. Others drew pictures, flames, black-robed figures, a towering man with hollow eyes whom they called the Voice. One boy, Thomas Halbrook, disappeared from his home in 1863. When searchers found him 3 days later, he was standing barefoot in the ruins of the church, ash smeared across his face like war paint. He told them he had been called there, that the fire was still alive, and that it wanted him. Another, a girl named Clara, would awaken at night screaming of smoke. She insisted her dead father came to her bedside each evening, whispering, "The spirit is not gone. It waits for us all." Doctors dismissed these cases as hysteria, the inherited madness of parents traumatized by the fire. But neighbors avoided these families. They said their livestock died without reason. Their wells turned foul. Their children's laughter carried. The sound of weeping when heard from a distance. By the 1870s, some of these children had grown, and what they carried with them was not merely trauma, but faith. They called themselves the Children of Ash, a scattered generation who believed the Ravencrofts had not perished in fire, but had been purified, reborn into something greater. And slowly, in whispers and shadows, the cult that had burned began to smolder again. History loves to lie. It tells us that the Church of the Pure Spirit died in 1851, that the fire marked an ending. But what if it was only a beginning? In the decades after the ruins blackened the land, sightings increased. Travelers claimed to see torchlight moving among the trees at night, smoke rising without fire. Chants carried by the wind. In 1891, a farmer stumbled upon a group of figures in the ruins. They were kneeling in a circle, their hands raised, their voices low. When he approached, they scattered into the trees, but not before he saw one of them lift a mask, the charred, blackened likeness of Ezra Ravencroft. The children of Ash had grown, and they had not forgotten. Their rituals echoed those of their parents' purity through pain, spirit through fire. In barns and cellars across the Northeast, animals were found mutilated, arranged in patterns identical to those once drawn in blood across the church walls. And then came the disappearances. In 1895, 3 vagrants vanished near the ruins, weeks. Later, their bodies were discovered in shallow graves, positioned upright, their arms stretched toward the sky as if in worship. Each had their eyelids burned away. The newspapers called it superstition, a grotesque prank. But those who lived nearby knew better. They remembered the fire. They remembered the voices. And they whispered of a chilling possibility that the Ravencrofts' followers had returned, led by spirits, guided by shadows. Even the authorities were not immune. One sheriff investigating the disappearances wrote in his final report, "The ground here feels wrong, as though it breathes. I heard my name in the wind last night, not shouted, whispered. I do not believe the dead are gone. I believe they are here. And I believe they are waiting." Weeks later, the sheriff vanished without a trace. What do we mean when we speak of ghosts? Are they the wandering dead souls unable to rest? Or are they something deeper? Echoes of violence, shadows of memory, fragments of belief so strong they refused to fade. In the case of the Ravencrofts, the ghosts were all of these at once. Through the 20th century, the ruins remained a scar on the land. Locals avoided it, though teenagers dared each other to enter, often. Returning pale and shaken, they spoke of shapes moving among the trees, of chants that rose and fell, though no one was there, of a fire they could feel but not see, its heat pressing against their skin. Investigators, journalists, even skeptics all reported the same sensations, the feeling of being watched, of whispers at the edge of hearing, of something reaching from the soil into their bones. And the murders did not stop throughout the early 1900s. Physicians connected to the original trial of the Ravencrofts died under strange and brutal circumstances. Each body was discovered, posed like the victims of the church, each marked with a note the spirit sees, coincidence, or a promise fulfilled by those who carried the Ravencrofts' blood, their faith, their fire. By mid-century, the legend of the pure spirit had spread beyond New York. Occult circles in Europe spoke of the Ravencrofts as saints of suffering. Their rituals were reenacted in hidden chambers. Their words, once ash, became scripture again, and still the ruins smoldered. Still the land whispered. Even today, visitors claim the soil is unnaturally warm, that the trees around the clearing bend inward as though bowing, that at night faint figures can be seen moving through the smoke. The ghosts remain not as memory, not as rumor, but as presence. A fire that refuses to die, the Church of the Pure Spirit, was not destroyed in 1851, it was unleashed. And if you stand among the ruins long enough, you may feel it too. The watching, the whispering, the fire beneath the soil, because some ghosts do not fade, some ghosts remain.